This is a film about women who had to abort their daughters. About men who can no longer find a wife. And about girls who are kidnapped because of that. And about desperate parents. Almost 200 million girls and women are missing globally today. How could it come to this? And why do we know so little about it?
Here, have a look. Would you please read this? Please help us.
Guangxi is a province in southern China. Pang Jingdong and Hu Aizhen are parents who are searching for their daughter. 3-year-old Peng Shuting disappeared a month ago without a trace. At first, nobody believed that something terrible could have occurred in this peaceful village where everyone knows each other. But the search for her has remained fruitless.
We looked for her for days. We searched every corner, day and night.
5 days and nights.
She was gone.
All that remains for the parents are the memories and baby photos from happier times.
She's so small here. She was so cute, so adorable. How could this happen?
Du Yin knows a lot of despairing parents. He works for a relief organization. Throughout China, there are already 200,000 volunteers searching for missing girls, such as Pang Shuting.
Kidnapping of little girls are not uncommon in China. A son's marriage is expensive because the bride's family expect expensive engagement gifts. For this reason, parents have little girls kidnapped. They then raise the girl together with their son. And when they've reached adulthood, they are married to one another.
There is a shortage of millions of women in the world's most populous country. 135 boys are born for every 100 girls in some provinces in China. This is the result of an experiment that started decades ago on the other side of the world. In the USA, after World War II, it was the era of the economic miracle. People in the West were doing better than ever before, if not for the fear that their prosperity could soon come to an end. A big concern was constantly growing populations due to medical advances, especially in developing countries. Affluent Americans started a new movement. Together they wanted to curb the large numbers of children worldwide. Most of them were men, from well-known scientists to the super-rich, like John D. Rockefeller III. They were people with influence and connections to the highest levels of the American government. Their foundations still continue to exist today. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Population Council. They triggered a rising tide of fear of a population explosion that soon also spread to other countries, and they formed the head of worldwide measures taken to decimate the population of the impoverished. This has been examined by Matthew Connolly, a historian at Columbia University in New York. He has researched in detail the development of this movement, from its beginnings to its impact today.
Population Council saw its mandate not just to control the rate of population growth, but also to address problems in the quality of population. So they had an explicit mandate to try to do something about the growth of the fertility rates among people who they thought would eventually take over the world if something wasn't done to reduce fertility rates across the board, but especially among people who they thought would be poor parents and would have even more poor children.
This way of thinking also took hold in American politics in 1966. US President Lyndon B. Johnson attached conditions for receiving development aid, one of them being that recipient countries must reduce their population. It was a time of drought and starvation in India. The president spoke on the phone with his Secretary of Agriculture.
Then you just put down this morning instructions to all your people that the president says any future allotments, he wants to know what we give, and Exhibit A, he wants to know what we get. So let's evaluate that too. And I know the first sentence will be, we feed a lot of hungry children. I know that, so I don't need to be told. But just tell me what else we get out of it. Usually we just get kicked in the pants. That's what she does to us.
He stopped food deliveries until Indian President Indira Gandhi bowed to the demands. Accusations were made that the West had imperialistic intentions with its population control projects. A Department for Population Control was founded at the United Nations in 1969, the UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund. Through this ostensibly neutral path, Western governments channeled millions into population control in developing countries. The major donors, besides the United States, were Sweden, Great Britain, Germany, and Switzerland. South Korea was among the earliest testing grounds for population control. The country was devastated after the Korean War. At the same time, there was a baby boom with the highest birth rates in the world. The United States participated in the reconstruction from the very beginning. Population control was high on the agenda. These 4 Korean women grew up in a village 200 kilometers from Seoul and still remember the war and the time that followed.
The government said we should have fewer children. That's why we stuck to it. We women had abortions. We thought we were doing the right thing, and we did it voluntarily.
Western countries donated buses and jeeps that were converted into mobile medical units. Documents show that their task was not health promotion. The Population Council, an American foundation, expressed a clear-cut mission to the Korean Ministry of Health.
These vehicles are given to help improve living standards in Korea through a vigorous attack on the problem of excessive population growth.
Instead of letting citizens plan their own families, family planners made having fewer children a citizen's duty. They were not interested in fighting poverty, but only in preventing the poor from having babies. Mobile clinics in India went to secluded villages as early as 1956, because Indians were also supposed to have fewer children. Western family planners flooded the country. One of the pioneers was the American doctor Sheldon Segal. He founded a department for reproductive medicine in one of the largest state hospitals in New Delhi and trained Indian medical students. Although early versions of IUDs had fallen into disrepute in the West, Segal smuggled them into India in 1964. He declared them as Christmas decorations at customs and had them inserted into the uteri of women without the knowledge of the government. In a letter, he wrote,
"The present approach is to distribute the ones I have on hand to private gynecologists. We are also inserting some in monkey uteri. My feeling is that in the long run, it may be faster to quietly accumulate evidence from these sources before trying to press for wider distribution in government family planning clinics. I do not want to raise the question with Health Minister Dr. Nair if the answer is likely to be negative, because we would then be in a precarious position if we pursue human studies at all."
It didn't take long for the Indian government to give the green light. The United States Agency for International Development even sent non-sterile intrauterine devices to India. Serious complications often arose, sometimes with fatal consequences. Despite this, the family planners increased the pressure, and the Indian government cooperated. They set quotas for sterilizations and IUD insertion, paying doctors and health workers premiums. Poor, uneducated women were the main targets. The bait? Money in exchange for their fertility.
So you had this system where people at every level were being given money. Money from the United States, from the United Nations, from Sweden, from Norway, money to agree to sterilization, or money to get other people to agree to sterilization, even if in some cases that eventually meant rounding them up and trucking them to camps where they would sometimes sterilize under the most appalling circumstances.
Sheldon Segal visited one of these camps in 1962. He described it to his superior.
"I spent Sunday at a women's sterilization camp and found it fascinating. After the surgeon sews up the abdomen, the ladies get off the operating table by themselves and walk out of the operating theatre."
The situation in India spun out of control. In 1975, the government of Indira Gandhi forced 8 million women and men to undergo sterilization. This dark chapter in Indian history became known as the emergency period.
The idea of population control, what was so seductive to national leaders, people like Indira Gandhi, was the idea that they could achieve modernity in one generation. And they could do it with crash programs. Even if it required taking some risks, even if some people were going to get hurt, this was something that was going to make India a modern nation, and it was going to improve everyone's welfare in the long run. What they didn't understand, though, was that in many rural societies, these children were their parents' only source of security in old age, right? And not only that, but in poorer societies, even children in many cases are able to support themselves and help their parents, even from a relatively young age.
But there is another reason as to why people in Asia have many children. They want a son, and so they continue to have children until they have their male descendant. The family planners recognized this preference for sons as the key to solving the population problem.
People at places like the Population Council and the Ford Foundation, they realized that parents in poor societies in many cases preferred to have sons. And what they began to think was that if only they had some way of helping those parents determine whether the fetus was a female or a male, then they might, along with abortion, they might have a quick way of reducing fertility rates.
The head of the Population Council laid down a clear course in 1967.
Augmented research efforts leading to improved contraceptive technologies or practical methods of determining the sex of an unborn child so that parents could be assured of a son.
In the early 1970s, the time had finally come. Scientists developed chorionic villus sampling, or CVS. With this method, a child's sex could be identified before birth. Abortion was forbidden in almost all developing countries. Sheldon Segal and his colleagues used their connections to the highest ranks in the US government, and with great success. Henry Kissinger was US President Gerald Ford's Secretary of State at the time. In a 1974 document that was long kept classified, He demanded the massive depopulation of developing countries and declared abortion to be an indispensable tool for population control.
No country has reduced its population growth without resorting to abortion.
While women in the United States were still heading to the streets to demand the right to control their own bodies, American foundations and politicians were pressuring developing countries to legalize abortion. In the following decades, a massive surplus of men was created in Asia through the abortion of daughters. The consequences are omnipresent in India today. Once again, those who suffer most are girls and women of low socioeconomic standing. Like 19-year-old Sajina.
My mother and older sister died on 2 consecutive days. I was 6 months old at the time. Then my father contracted polio and my grandmother raised me. My father went out to beg and we lived off what he brought back. That's how we 4 kids grew up.
Today, Sajina lives with her brother Shamshul's family. He is her protector and saved her life 3 years ago when she suddenly disappeared from her village. After Sajina vanished, Shamshul sold everything, travelled 2,000 kilometres to New Delhi and reported her disappearance to the aid organisation of Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi.
Some men offered my sister work. She declined. After that, she disappeared. She was able to get hold of a phone and call me when she wasn't being watched. She was crying and begged me to get her out of there. I went there and saw her. Blood was coming out of her eyes and her face had been cut.
Coming from a lower caste, Shamshul was not able to accomplish anything on his own. The police turned him away several times. But after pressure from the aid organisation, they finally went to the village where Sajina was being held. A woman claiming to be Sajina's mother-in-law pulled out a marriage certificate. The shortage of women is particularly extreme in the northern India state of Haryana. Parents desperately seek wives for their sons. The village elder eventually explained what had happened to Sajina.
We paid 50 or 60,000 rupees as a down payment. I can prove it.
Just give us the girl. We're not leaving without her.
It's all legal. I married her in front of 11 witnesses.
The truth finally came out when the residents turned the girl over to police. The entire village had collected money to buy Sajina for a number of bachelors. She was married to one man and abused as a sex slave by 7 others. This is one of the consequences of the severe lack of women. Sajina is no exception. Human traffickers comb the slums looking for girls. When they disappear, hardly anyone goes looking for them. The traffickers are often acquaintances or neighbours. Sajina's kidnapper still lives in her village. Nobody blames him, whereas she was labelled a whore and was forced to leave home. Girls and women like Sajina suffer the consequences of population policies introduced and expedited by Western family planners 50 years ago in India.
No pregnant woman thought that she could selectively kill girls and have only boys. So this was created by the so-called academic medical profession, promoted by Ford Foundation and a lot of other NGOs which funded the whole project. I think they took 30 students per year in BSc genetics. So in about 5 years, there was a corpus of a few hundred people who could tell whether it's a boy or a girl.
Gynecologist Puneet Bedi was trained at the same hospital where Sheldon Segal carried out his research. As a young student, Bedi had a dramatic experience in the delivery room.
The first night that I went to the hospital, I saw a stray cat in the hospital. It might surprise you, but it's not unusual in government hospitals to see stray dogs and cats, carrying what looked like a mass of flesh or something outside running out of the labor room. So I went inside and I asked people what happened. So one of them said that the cat may have taken away the placenta or the fetus that was delivered. So a 6-7 month old fetus was delivered and it was dumped just under the bed of the delivering woman. So then I was told it is a project and there's research going on. Somebody's writing a paper on it and how to find out it is a boy or a girl before birth by doing amniocentesis. And if it's a girl, of course, then we abort.
Prenatal sex determination was the biggest breakthrough in population control. This way, girls were aborted en masse, and birth rates were reduced twofold. Fewer babies were being born, and fewer girls that could later bear children. Daughters are weeded out in China as well. 1 in 5 boys presently born will later be unable to find a wife. Mothers are worried. They advertise at countless marriage markets for their surplus sons. In Shanghai, there is such a market every Sunday in People's Park.
I'm here for the second time today. I'm looking for the right girl for my son. Many people have come up to me. We exchanged phone numbers and information. The mothers will now ask their daughters if they're interested in my son, and then we'll talk on the phone. We parents help our children to establish contact.
These are mothers who only have one son because they were permitted to only have one child. This was the Chinese strategy for population control. US President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arrived in Beijing in 1972. It was a historic meeting with Mao Zedong to discuss the balance of power and a mutual commitment to world peace.
There is no reason for us to be enemies. Neither of us seeks domination over the other. Neither of us seeks to stretch out our hands and rule the world.
But the Americans were worried about the growth of Chinese power and the spread of communism, and the fact that Chinese population growth seemed unstoppable. Nixon's visit opened the floodgates for Western family planners. The Chinese government had a sympathetic ear for them. Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, introduced the one-child policy. Millions were trained as lay health workers, the so-called barefoot doctors. Their mission? Distributing contraceptives all over the country and ensuring that couples only had one child. Family planning became a matter of state. If anyone expected a second child, they faced draconian punishments. The government used graffiti on building facades to warn people to toe the line.
You can beat it out, you can kill it, you just cannot give birth to it.
In In spite of media reports of forced sterilization and abortions, the West continued to donate money to the Chinese population program. At first, this only came from organizations like the Ford Foundation, but in 1979, even the United Nations Population Fund gave $50 million to the Chinese government. An employee of IPPF, one of the donor organizations, sounded the alarm.
I think that in the not-too-distant future, this will blow up into a major press story, as it contains all the ingredients of sensationalism. Communism, forced family planning, murder of viable fetuses, parallels with India, etc. And when it does blow up, it's going to be very difficult to defend.
But the warnings were not only ignored. The UN Population Fund also presented China with an award for outstanding contributions regarding birth control.
Who did they choose to give it to? It wasn't to reproductive rights advocates. It wasn't to people whose lives were at risk because they were trying to campaign to give people, and especially women, the right to own and control their own bodies. It was just the opposite. They decided to honor the leader of China's coercive population control program, a Chinese general, who had presided over the most egregious period in the entire history of that program. And they chose to honor Indira Gandhi, who was responsible for what until then was the worst population program of all, the emergency period program in India.
Is the UN Population Fund facing up to this dark chapter of its past?
But what is almost never discussed is the history of that program and how it is at an early stage the UN Population Fund was deeply involved in an incredibly coercive program. And if we can't get the UN Population Fund to acknowledge that, then how is it they're going to get people to trust them to do the right thing now and in the future?
Why did the UN Population Fund financially support countries that forced people to be sterilized and have abortions?
I need to be very clear about the role of UNFPA. Those awards were given by the United Nations member states. That is it. We carry out their instructions.
At that time, the United States was the most important member state, contributing 40% of the budget. Was the UN Population Fund simply the puppet of its benefactors? 40 years after these population policies supported by the West, over 30 million Chinese men remain involuntary bachelors because of the shortage of women. This is why millions of unemployed men from rural areas move to the cities. Activist Du Yin visits the parents of Peng Shuting, the little girl who disappeared. But he doesn't have good news. There is still no trace of their 3-year-old daughter.
How am I doing? I don't know. As we never found blood anywhere, I believe she is still alive. I wait for signs of life every day. I'm very worried.
The girls are often abducted by someone from the village. Before the child reaches the person who contracted to have her taken, she will have passed through many hands, from the kidnapper to middleman, from the village to the city, and from there, often to another province. With each transaction, the price goes up. Ultimately, the product, the girl, costs roughly $8,000. And for the buyers, the deal always pays off.
If the son doesn't like the bride after all, or if the two don't make a good match, then the parents can still marry the young girl off to another family. After all, they raised her as their own daughter in a way. A high bride price is often agreed upon. For them, it's worth it either way.
Statistics in India show the higher the surplus of men, the higher the crime rate and the number of violent crimes against women. The Indian government has since reacted and outlawed sex determination in the early 1990s. And yet, there has never been as many abortions of girls as today. Because with ultrasound technology, sex determination has become cheap and safe. Despite the ban, it's only a question of money to find a doctor who is willing to break the law and reveal the gender of the unborn child. The middle class in India is growing. And as expected, educated Indians want fewer children. Little has changed about the preference for sons, especially in the upper class. Amisha was 25 years old when she married a computer scientist. Her father-in-law was a high-ranking government employee. In India, the bride must pay the groom's family a dowry. Amisha gave her in-laws an apartment. Having a son is like winning the lottery for some people in India.
They wanted me to have a son. It had to be a boy. A son and heir for the clan. I was kept completely in the dark. They said, "Come see the doctor." So I did. I never knew what they had discussed with the doctor. If it was a girl, the doctor would say, "Jai Mata Di," the holy goddess. That was their code word. Then they would know I was expecting a girl. The doctor then gave me an injection in my belly, and when I woke up, the baby in my belly was gone. They did that 6 times in 8 years. Not only did my daughters die, I died during all this too. I'm dead inside. When I was pregnant with the daughter I have now, they tried the same thing again. But I got sick and went to my mother's. They wanted to pick me up and take me to the doctor, but I refused to go.
Amisha was lucky. A lawyer for human rights took on her case. He had her in-laws put in jail for a short time and negotiated a settlement. But he couldn't help her get over the loss of her 6 daughters. It has gone virtually unnoticed that fewer and fewer girls are being born. Today there is officially a shortage of 177 million. And the number of countries that are culling daughters is growing. There are currently 19. As in China and India, the lack of women of marriageable age in South Korea has now become a problem. Just like in China and India, the lack of women of marriageable age in South Korea has now become a problem.
Yes, there are too few women here, so the farmers can't find wives. They look for one somewhere else. They say it costs around $10,000 to get one from Vietnam. These women are usually about 20 years old and give birth to very lovely children. There are many of these women living in our area.
두 일찍 낳았어. 우리 때도 많이 왔어.
A lucrative business has emerged around women as a commodity. That which is missing in one's own market after decades of selective abortion is simply imported from poorer neighbouring countries. But South Korea faces another problem. Nowadays, many South Korean women do not want to have children at all. The population is drastically declining. Once again, politics has intervened with drastic measures. Whereas young women 60 years ago were encouraged to have abortions, now it is strongly frowned upon and criminally prosecuted to terminate a pregnancy. Lee Ha-young and Wang Shi-song, two students from Seoul, recalled what they learned at school on the subject of abortion.
We were taught about pregnancy and abortion in elementary school. They show us films about abortion, and they say that the embryo's neck is cut in the uterus, and then the whole embryo is cut up and disposed of. That's how they explain abortion, and they say abortion is murder. This is what's taught in school and what's stuck in our minds. We are only able to view abortions as something terrible.
The young women examine the subject of abortion for their master's thesis. Byun Hwa-soon, who directed the Women's Development Institute in Seoul for 25 years, is an advisor to the students. The students track down dubious agencies that arbitrate illegal abortions for large sums of money. Once again, women are the victims of population policy. Illegal abortions bear great health risks. But the South Korean government holds on to the ban on abortion. Today, their mission is children at all costs.
What was the government after back then when they allowed abortions? Did they want to support women's rights? Today we can see that it wasn't about that. It was about population control. They were using women's bodies as a political tool.
The South Korean government has even gone so far as to publish a map of Seoul on the internet, showing where women of childbearing age live. The darker the pink colour, the greater the selection for men seeking a wife. The Chinese government has also noticed that a society without women will die out in the long run. A two-child policy has been introduced in the hope of regaining a gender balance and solving the problem of an ageing population. The government is again resorting to advertisements on building facades. This time it is for daughters and therefore potential future mothers.
No girls means no daughters-in-law.
The government in India is also backpedaling. It also wants to motivate people to give birth to daughters. There is one information campaign after another. Once again, the Indian government is offering incentives.
Anyone giving birth to a daughter receives $35 and a thank you letter from the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare.
Gynecologist Puneet Bedi is familiar with the pressure on pregnant women. He too performs abortions, but never when it is a matter of the sex of the fetus. Dr. Bedi doesn't think much of the new government programs.
Give me one reason how I suppose as a woman, she's pregnant, who's never gone to school. The day she was born, she was told that she's because she's a woman, and then she gets pregnant in a new home where 7 other people are telling her every day that, you will lose everything that you have in life if you produce a girl. How do you change her mindset? by showing some street play, or writing a poem, or inventing a television spot. No, it doesn't work. Now, the ultimate solution is, of course, that people start respecting girls more than boys.
They wanted to protect the world from a population explosion, but they waged war on the poor, not on poverty. Had they supported education and the economic security of women, birth rates would have gone down on their own. Instead, they forced through contraception, sterilization, and abortion. Now, history is repeating itself. The UN Population Fund still uses 60% of its aid for family planning. And once again, private foundations demand population reduction.
It makes me nervous that just as in the 1950s and 60s, it was the Rockefeller and Ford Foundation that issued marching orders to people all over the world, it makes me nervous when I hear it's the Gates Foundation now, because of its money, that's playing a preponderant role in global public health. Similarly, when back in the 1950s and 60s, you had leaders from all over the world agreeing that population growth was a crisis, right? And agreeing that the United Nations had to implement crash programs. It makes me nervous now when people talk about the crisis of climate change and how it is we might even have to engage in crash programs.
Today, Africa is the main focus for population control. The World Bank and the UN Population Fund are currently pumping millions into family planning on the second largest continent. And a large American corporation is supplying the ultrasound devices. As in China, South Korea and India, people in most African countries prefer sons.